Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome back to our Bread for the Journey series in our Advent series. We are picking up with our theme on a new Oxford movement, and today and next week and the week following, we will have our own Dr. Jeffrey Smith talking to us about music in a new Oxford movement. I don't think he needs too much more introduction than that, so I'll let him get right to it. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I'm going to start with a disclaimer, and also a disclaimer from me and a free pass for you, and that is, I make no pretense to being a musicologist, and your free pass is you need not know a lot about music to, I hope, enjoy some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to try to stay away from technical jargon as well. I suppose the three words that have already come up in some of the publicity, though, are musical words: consonance, dissonance, and resolution. So in another context, these words might be called thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so much of our Anglican Church history is about coping with what you might say is creative tension. And music has this creative tension built into it. We might say that dissonance is a way of moving music forward, because if music didn't have dissonance, it would boil down to some sort of a sugary, watery, undefinable thing. And in music, dissonance is kind of like spice in cooking. We all have our tolerance level of spice, and we all perhaps expect pain if we exceed that tolerance level. But without dissonance, music would not move. But remember that these terms are relative, and part of the relativity has to do with acoustics. I won't bore you with stuff you probably remember from early piano lessons, the categorization of intervals, which is the distance between two pitches, into generally these two classes of interval. These perfect intervals are acoustically perfect. They can only be tuned one way, the unison, fourth, fifth, and octave. The imperfect intervals can be major and minor in any variety of tuning on the seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. But in the Middle Ages, a third or a sixth was actually considered dissonant. So this gives an interesting color to medieval music. Here's a typical cadence in medieval music. Now it starts with a fifth and an octave, and there's no third. Okay, so thirds and sixths existed in medieval music, but they were considered to be impure and not restful. So that, in a sense, is a way that consonance and dissonance throughout history, musical history, is also a relative thing. And we can fast forward to the great Bach. Yeah, exactly. Look at that pedal technique. And to remind you that among many amusing stories of Bach's biography, he was fired from his first church job, age 21, in Arnstadt. For among other reasons, he was playing what they called strange tones. And I think that this had something to do with his improvisations and his dissonances. The congregation in Arnstadt probably wanted to hear something like this. Whereas Bach's version might have been something like this. To them, that was too distant. That had strange tones. Now, to us, of course, that's magnificent. But as I said, times change. The perception of dissonance and consonance is a relative thing. So, when we look at this model, you might say, for what our Anglican heritage has been and could be, I want you to keep in mind that consonance, dissonance, and resolution have been kind of a slippery target throughout history. We like to boast, we Anglicans, about liturgical theology, as opposed to, say, systematic theology. Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Lutheran and Reformed traditions have systematic theologians like Aquinas and Calvin and Karl Barth and the like. We Anglicans have a liturgical theology, and that is one of our strengths, and it also makes things very messy, because along the timeline we have to deal with a lot of dissonance, because we can't decide often whether are we a monarchical church, are we Catholic, are we Protestant, are we Sarum Rite, are we Roman Rite, do we openly celebrate pluriform cultures, or are we old-fashioned Anglo-imperialists culturally and in the closet? Do we sort of foist our Downton Abbey tastes on others without theirs? Who knows? When we look at the music tradition of the Anglo-Catholic world, we find that this tension is built in at the very beginning. And I'm going to use one example of that musically, and it has to do with the word false relation. False relation is a term of art in music, which refers to harmonies which are resolved in an unusual way. And in essence, that an accidental which appears in one part of the choir is resolved in another part of the choir. The term false relation sometimes is replaced by the term cross relation, because too many music history students are liable to come up with hillbilly jokes when you say false relation. So let me give you an example of that in this famous motet of Bird, Ave Verum Corpus. It's a very, very simple melody at the beginning, and the sopranos really sing the tune and the other three parts accompany. Now, what makes this harmony a moment of genius is that this F sharp in the soprano isn't resolved as you would expect it to be in the soprano, but moves to an F here in the bass. So you have F sharp in the soprano, and then the next chord you have F in the bass. And that's a false relation. Another composer would write something like this. Bird wrote, and it's the shocking nature of that third chord on the word verum, true, which has a sort of a sweet and sour. It's kind of a shocking, deliciously poignant moment. Later on in the same motet, we have many false relations between the soprano B flat and a tenor B natural, the alto B natural, and a bass B flat, back and forth between one version of the chord and another, sort of rocking between these two extremes. And then later on in the motet, we actually have, at the words miserere mei, we actually have two two accidentals going simultaneously. We have a G sharp in the tenor and a G natural in the bass at exactly the same time. So it's as if it's sort of a ripping gesture. It's extremely poignant. And these false relations were used by many other cultures as well, but only in the English tradition of music, do these false relations form an ongoing history from before the time of Bird, really all the way up to the present day. So let's listen now to the Bird Ave Verum Corpus.
picture of. So what is it other word? Must have been the Rockies.
I guess you'll have to sing it.
Shall we all just sing it? you think?
We need all the points for all those false relations.
I hope no one here is a false relation. Another example of moving about 400 years into the future is the motet by Herbert Howells, Light as the Heart. Now, this piece is a classic, like the bird, of Anglican repertoire. And what's very unusual here is that the piece is in E minor, 1 sharp. And instead of starting on the home tone chord, the first sound you hear is actually an unresolved dissonance. It's a chord which is not home tone chord. Then there's a dissonant note, this F sharp on beat 3. And then over here in the second bar, there's something even more extraordinary, which is a blues chord, which he's lifted sort of from the works of Gershwin. And I can only imagine in 1943 what the effect of that chord would have been. We're used to these sort of things, but in 1943, church music was, shall we say, in a narrower group. Now the melody that Howells is harmonizing goes like this. Other people would have harmonized it like this. Instead we get, and then the blues chord. And there is within that harmony a great sense of sensual longing. And I think that's part of the Anglican tradition as well. That there's a melding of major and minor, sweet and sour. And things aren't always as clear. So that, once again, that resolution of the dissonance is something which is unique to the Anglican musical world. So, if the days of William Byrd would be considered one of the glory days of Anglican music, the nadir would be about 1700 to 1875. During this period, not only the Anglican Church, but its liturgy was probably at its lowest ebb. In fact, even though cathedrals and college chapels did maintain the daily office, the actual standards were really appalling. In 1790, a new organist was appointed to Rochester Cathedral, which is in Kent. And while digging around to see what awaited him, he discovered that the choir of Rochester Cathedral had sung in their repertoire 2 canticle settings and 7 anthems for the last 12 years in rotation. And prior to the second generation of tractarians, which are really the musicians we're going to be talking about, parish churches didn't really have choirs as we know them today. It's a new concept. What they would have is a group of singers and instrumentalists in the rear gallery, and they would perform, and I use that word very deliberately, they would perform. And what they would perform would be versions of the Psalms. Not the Psalms themselves, but metrical Psalms, sort of like what we would call some of our hymns, which are paraphrases of Psalms. And this is vividly described in some of Thomas Hardy's novels, like Under the Greenwood Tree and Far from the Madding Crowd. Incidentally, the box pews, which came to be so hated by the tractarians, they have, of course, a large role to play not only in English parish churches, but in our own colonial churches as well. And because, of course, this would be a family pew, and because it had benches on all sides, you could turn to face wherever you wanted to face. So that while the singers in the gallery were singing, people would turn and sit over there and goggle up at the gallery because perhaps they had their eye on one of the sopranos or something. And hence the term "face the music" came from that tradition. In about the 1830s, if you had said to a churchgoer the phrase "church choir," this would be the sort of thing that would come to mind. Rather improvised group. But about a generation or generation and a half later, if you said the word church choir, say in the 1860s or 70s, something like this would come to mind. Now, how did such a radical change come to pass? Well, the second generation of Oxford movement clerics and musicians, they couldn't simply intellectualize something into being. They had to actually formulate plans, and they had to become pioneering teachers, and they had to promote a better way. And they certainly did this by their preaching and by their pamphleteering and by their mentorship of the next generation. But they also did it just by hard slog, and we're going to look at two pioneering individuals whose life and whose work really represented this hard slog of teaching people a better way. And we're going to start with a gentleman called the Reverend Dr. Frederick Arthur Gore Ouseley, Baronet, or Bart, which is the abbreviation of baronet. And he was called the Bart when he was up at Oxford. Ouseley, after he was ordained, sang in the choir of St. Paul's, Knightsbridge, and he became a curate to that parish's mission parish, which was St. Barnabas, Pimlico. And St. Barnabas, Pimlico was then extremely progressive because, first of all, it was a new church, so it was the architecture could be exactly as the Tractarians wanted it to be. And it was, compared to Knightsbridge, it was in a very poor neighborhood, and once again, it had no pew rents. So this was a model Tractarian church, and Ouseley used quite a bit of his family fortune to build this church and school. This church went up in 1850, and 1850 was a difficult year. It was the year of the so-called papal aggression, which was really a misperception that there was a fifth column within the CEV trying to draw people away into the Roman Catholic Church. And the vicar of St. Paul's, Knightsbridge, and also St. Barnabas, Pimlico, the Reverend Bennett, found himself in big trouble with his own bishop, and he found himself pilloried by the social media of the day, the various newspapers. And there were even protests during the services at St. Barnabas that were complaining about, among other things, a surpliced choir and Gregorian chant. This was considered far too Roman. And they even objected to the bells, and they would sing a song that went, "Hush by Bennett on the church top, when your bells cease, the outcry will stop. If you don't stop when reason shall call, down will go Bennett's bell ring and all." And indeed, Bennett was forced to resign. And Ouseley, his curate, was a man of, shall we say, delicate temperament. He also resigned. So there was a gigantic bust-up at Knightsbridge and Pimlico. And Ouseley then went off to have a restorative tour, as so many do, of the continent. He went to German churches and Italian churches, and he learned a lot. And the most important thing about his experience at St. Barnabas and then his restorative tour of the continent was that he came back to England and he was fired by mission. And his mission brought to bear in a brand new establishment that he created of his own fortune, of his own device, and that was St. Michael's College, Tenbury. He wanted to build a school that would be, in essence, a training ground for young priests, musicians, and choristers. And he started from scratch. And the advantage of starting from scratch was he didn't have to answer to any low church bishops. He didn't have to repeat this debacle that he had in London. And he also could avoid what at that time had been very ill-served cathedral music with lazy priests and musicians that you might find in the Trollope Barchester novel. So he could, by starting from scratch, he could avoid both of those extremes. He settled on this really remote location in Worcestershire near Wales. And he built, of course, in God's own Gothic, a school and a chapel at which there were daily services. He also underwrote significant annual losses, as you can imagine. The school closed in 1985. It was founded in 1856, closed in 1985. Ouseley had experienced firsthand the poor educational standards for children. And so this venture, which was, you might say, a utopian venture, led him at least to show up the cathedrals, who at that time, they certainly had the tradition, but they weren't following through with actual excellence. Incidentally, Ouseley's music is found in our hymnal. His style of writing is perhaps a bit too saccharine for most taste, but he was a fine composer. We move on now to our second figure, which is the Reverend Dr. Thomas Helmore. And Helmore was raised Congregationalist, but he converted, and after ordination, he was very influenced by the first wave of the Tractarians. And he got himself appointed to St. Mark's College in Chelsea. And by college, I'm using it in the English way, the college as in being a senior school or a high school. This is an unusual place, alas, no longer existing. It was what we would call a training college for teachers. And it was run by the C of E. And because it had an associated day school, this was a perfect laboratory to put into practice some of the musical changes that Helmore and others sought to bring about. So remember that the Oxford movement, the first wave of Oxford movement Tractarians had very little to do with music or ritual. The second generation, largely coming from Cambridge, were more interested in, shall we say, the nuts and bolts of the thing, and how to build churches, what to wear, what to sing, and that sort of thing. So Helmore was a very practical musician, as well as priest, and he set up this musical program at St. Mark's College in Chelsea to once again provide the daily office and to teach young seminarians how to sing the service, because hitherto this was something that which simply wasn't done. Back in the days of those box pews and the gallery choirs, remember that the only singing, the only music you would hear in church are these metrical psalms, and none of that had anything to do with the liturgy. So you'd have matins, or you'd have matins and anti-communion, none of which was sung, none of the responses, and believe it or not, none of the psalms. The psalms were read between the parish clerk and the congregation. So this was a very different proposition where high church priests were expected to be able to sing the service, and Helmore basically made that happen. These daily services at St. Mark's College, Chelsea, were very interesting because Helmore and his like, they felt very strongly that the music had to be very unemotional and very pure, and they actually coined the term sublime style, by which they meant nothing too showy. They disliked using the organ because they thought that would be too flashy. And they liked would then have been very unpopular, which is the music of Byrd and Tallis and Gibbons and the like. By the 1850s, that would be considered very, very dry. They also borrowed Italian music like Palestrina. And of course, they sang it in English because Latin, even in Tractarian circles, singing in Latin would be a step too far. So one of the party badges at this time was plain song. And Helmore is a notable figure for no other reason than he created the first plain song psalter in English in 1843. And it's from that psalter that really our psalm singing here at St. Paul derives. The idea, again, being that that the congregation should be able to sing these psalms on their own. That was a radical concept. We'll see later that other musicians felt that the psalms were too difficult for the congregation to sing because they don't rhyme and they aren't metric. But Helmore and the people at St. Mark's College, Chelsea, disagreed, and they created a book called the Psalter Noted, which allowed practically anybody to sing the psalms. Ouseley and his camp preferred Anglican chant, and they preferred a more melodious approach. But Helmore felt that the Gregorian chant was again a linking hands through the centuries of this return to a medieval Christendom. By about the middle of the century, you had a divide roughly along these lines. Have a look. Anybody who can suggest why I just played that tune. And I'm not counting the fact that it's Advent. No point for that. Anyone?
Oh, it's an Advent tune.
Mm. I'm afraid you don't get a point for that, Wally.
No big deal.
It's Gregorian.
We're getting on to it. Okay, just as a sidebar, that tune which we all know and love, we think it's buried in the mist of monastic medieval hymnody. No, that the tune is ancient. The words are ancient. The combination thereof, 1851, by Thomas Helmore, the man we're talking about. So Helmore found this melody in an old chant book, and would you believe the melody that we all know and love is from tropes from the Requiem Mass. And he knew, of course, the ode antiphons, which are the text. And he, for the first time, said, well, if I take this text and that tune and put them together, I'll have something that everybody can sing. And we thank him forevermore. But the interesting thing is that Veni Emmanuel that we all know and love is actually not ancient. It dates from 1851, created by this Thomas Helmore figure. So this kind of party line divide shows you that already in the first generation of musicians, you had dissonance. You had a variety of opinions, sometimes very strongly felt. And quite frankly, there's not too much compromise available. For example, are you going to either have hymns or not? You're going to have music that you hear on Saturday night at the opera, or will it be very different? Will it be anti-operatic? So this was built in to the Tractarian musical revival from the outset. And this period in the mid-19th century was, of course, when England was experiencing immense growth, and the middle class also was growing hugely. And this was a time when both children and adults were trained how to read music and how to appreciate music. And the choral societies of England were founded. And they, of course, became very popular with well-known pieces like Handel's Messiah and Haydn's Creation, and the oratorios of Mendelssohn, who was so beloved of Queen Victoria. And next week we're going to talk about the differing traditions of cathedral music and parish music. But for now, I'm just going to call you to remember that the purpose of a parish choir then, and probably now, is ambiguous. The purpose of a cathedral choir is not ambiguous. Whether it's whether it's the sort of growing out of the monastic tradition, whether it's the collegiate choirs founded by Henry VIII, for example, the purpose is pretty well nailed down. Whereas a parish choir, history has said, well, there are varying purposes. Now, Helmore and his crew would say that the purpose of a parish choir is primarily to lead the congregation. It's basically a subset of the congregation designed to lead. It's not designed to show off like those singers in the gallery. Ouseley and his team would basically say that there's no point in having a choir unless you give it something to do, and what you give it to do is worthy on its own. It's an objective offering, just like architecture, vestments, or flowers. But it brings to mind this one of the ongoing dissonances that we have in the Anglican music tradition, which is, in a parish situation, does the choir usurp the role of a congregation in its singing, or does it add, or just how does that work? We'll be getting into that next week and the following week also. But another question that comes to mind in this period is, how much of the attraction of surplus choirs is basically a romantic looking backwards towards some sort of a idealized medieval past? We had in this series Professor Hannah Mattis talk to us about the difference between real medievalism and then sort of a faux medieval outlook. And here we have to ask whether Ouseley, and Helmore were kind of creating a Sir Walter Scott Gothic fantasia. And then we should ask ourselves also, because we still like this sort of thing, and we still wear these sort of clothes in church. We need to ask ourselves, what are we doing with this? Are we creating some sort of a nostalgia trip? Or is there something that's more serious that we're doing? Now, when we talk about any kind of a new Oxford music in music, we might emulate Ouseley and Helmore on several characteristics. And both risked professional scorn, and they both sacrificed personally. This was an age when what they were doing, what they were teaching, was countercultural. And in matters of churchmanship, the stakes were very high. Not just in terms of being talked about in the newspaper, but also about losing one's job. And both of these figures founded schools as change agents. I'm fascinated by this because I recall that one of our guest speakers, Father Samuel Keyes from St. James Potomac, mentioned to us that in terms of a community, we should look at schools, because what you have in a school is a building a community day in, day out. And Father Keyes felt that the Episcopal churches, parishes, could do well to look at Episcopal schools in terms of, well, how does that work? And it's an interesting concept. And I don't think it's at all coincidental that both Ouseley and Helmore founded schools. Another thing that they had in common was that they were both establishment figures. So they both could have rested on their laurels, but instead they labored to open up the church. a wider branch of society. They were progressives. They rolled up their sleeves, not just talking about ideas, but actually doing things. It's interesting too that they were knowledgeable but not pedantic. Ousley was a musical antiquarian by avocation. He collected scores and he edited old music. Helmore too was an intellectual man, but their main point of focus was not the university, and was not with the people of immense learning. So they'd never have used this phrase, but I think both Ousley and Helmore were all about building community. So these musicians in the first Oxford movement, they battled some fantasies, and these fantasies were prevalent in their time, and they're prevalent in ours, and probably will be perhaps eternal fantasies. And I'm going to adopt the musical jargon, and I'll call these two fantasies of eternal consonance. First, that growth can occur without change. And secondly, that change can occur without conflict. So it's lovely to talk about what happened in 1843 in Pimlico or Tenbury, Worcestershire or Oxford. But I think what these gentlemen found trying to conquer these fantasies is what we find today. So returning to the theme of consonance and dissonance, one of the things that I most love and respect about St. Paul's is actually the dissonance. We dare to be out of step. We dare to be out of step with our culture. We dare to be out of step even with our Episcopal Church. And we dare to demonstrate a countercultural kind of devotion in terms of our time and our talent and our financial resources. So what might we dare to do to shape a new Oxford movement in music? And what would that look like? What would it sound like? Would it be what we've always done? That's a hard one, because what we've always done has always veered between the consonant and the dissonant without necessarily resolution. For example, the role of the choir. Or would it be, let's do what we always have done, but we'll just do a better job of it? Or would it be striking out boldly to something radically new? Because while I've just touched briefly on the history of these two individuals, Ousley and Helmore, in both cases, they were building something radically new, which got them into trouble and made them sacrifice quite a bit. What's the equivalent of that in our day? And what might that have to do with music? From my 5 years in California, I took away at least one good phrase, and that is, we like to surf on the edge of chaos. And that's not a phrase that Ousley and Helmore would have used either, but it's what they were doing. They were surfing on the edge of chaos. So that brings us to today. So I'll leave you now, before our question time, I'm going to leave you with this question. How might we be prophetic in linking music and mission in the here and now at St. Paul's? I'm going to leave you to ponder that for a week, and we're going to come back and unpack some other arenas of this consonance and dissonance. But I want to close with a heartening anecdote about an American composer, Charles Ives. He was a very peculiar man, Charles Ives. He was at least 2 or 3 generations ahead of his time. And if you know his music, you know that there's always a surprise around the corner, likable or not. And he staunchly defended his polyrhythms and his clashing harmonies and his pretty striking dissonance. He had no tolerance for the snowflakes of his age who would shudder at dissonant chords, or during a concert, even worse, they would hiss. And Ives, who was a crusty Yankee and not given to much subtlety, was famous for getting out of his seat at these concerts. He would get out of his seat and he would bellow at these offenders. He would say, "Stand up and take your dissonance like a man." So, now we may not like dissonance, and we may not be able to stand up, and we may not even be a man, but it seems to me that if we're going to build a new Oxford movement, we need to take a stand. And I leave you with that, and thank you for your attention.